December 13th, 1945. The morning air in Hamelin, Germany, carries an unusual tension. In the courtyard of the military prison, a crowd of Allied officials, journalists, and witnesses gather in complete silence. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy wooden door of cell 7 creaks open with an ominous finality. Out steps a man whose name had become synonymous with unspeakable horror across Europe. Josef Kramer, the man who earned the chilling nickname the Beast of Belsen, is about to take his final walk. In just 3 minutes, one of Nazi Germany's most notorious war criminals will be dead, executed by British hangman Albert Pierrepoint. But how did we get here? How did an unemployed electrician from Munich transform into one of history's most feared concentration camp commandants? What drove this seemingly ordinary man to commit crimes so heinous that they shocked even hardened Allied investigators? And what were his final moments like as he faced the ultimate price for orchestrating the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent people? Today, we're uncovering the complete story of Josef Kramer, from his humble beginnings in Bavaria to his final moments on the gallows. This is the story of how economic desperation, ideological fanaticism, and personal ambition combined to create a monster, and how justice finally caught up with the Beast of Belsen. Stay with us as we explore one of the most dramatic and consequential war crimes trials in history, culminating in an execution that helped establish the foundations of international criminal law. Early life and background. Josef Kramer was born on November 10, 1906, in Munich, then part of the German Empire. His story begins not with signs of future evil, but with the mundane reality of middle-class German life in the early 20th century. He was an only child, born to Theodor and Maria Kramer, who raised him in what they described as a strict Roman Catholic household. The Kramers were respectable, law-abiding citizens who embodied the values of traditional German society. Theodor worked as a civil servant, providing his family with a comfortable, if unremarkable, middle-class existence. Maria was a devoted mother who ensured young Joseph attended church regularly and received a proper Catholic education. By all accounts, there was nothing in his early childhood that would predict the monster he would become. In 1915, when Joseph was 9 years old, the family moved from Munich to Augsburg, where he completed his elementary education. He was described by teachers as an average student, neither particularly bright nor troublesome. He followed rules, completed his assignments, and caused no disciplinary problems. Those who knew him during this period remembered him as quiet, obedient, and unremarkable. After completing elementary school, Kramer began what seemed like a promising path toward a stable working-class career. In 1920, at age 14, he started an apprenticeship as an electrician. This was considered a good trade at the time. Electricians were in demand as Germany modernized its infrastructure, and the profession offered the prospect of steady employment and middle-class respectability. However, Kramer's early adult years were marked by instability and disappointment. He completed his electrical training but struggled to find consistent work. From 1925 to 1933, he experienced long periods of unemployment, broken only by occasional jobs in a department store and brief work as an accountant. These were not careers he had chosen, but simply whatever work he could find to survive. During these difficult years, Kramer continued living in his parents' house, unable to achieve the independence that young German men of his generation expected. The situation became even more desperate when his father Theodor also lost his job during the Great Depression. The entire Kramer family fell into economic hardship, joining millions of other Germans struggling to survive in an increasingly unstable economy. The psychological impact of this prolonged unemployment and economic insecurity cannot be understated. Kramer was in his 20s, the years when young men typically establish their careers, marry, and start families. Instead, he found himself trapped in his childhood home, dependent on his parents, with no clear path forward. This experience of powerlessness, humiliation, and economic anxiety would prove crucial in shaping his future choices. The path to Nazism. Josef Kramer's political awakening came during Germany's darkest economic hour. In December 1931, at age 25, he joined the Nazi Party, becoming member number 678,894. This decision was not made in isolation. Millions of Germans were making similar choices as traditional political institutions crumbled under the weight of economic crisis and social upheaval. 6 months later, in June 1932, Kramer took a more significant step by joining the SS, Heinrich Himmler's elite paramilitary organization that would become the primary instrument of Nazi terror. The SS offered young men like Kramer something that had been missing from their lives: purpose, belonging, and the promise of power. For someone who had spent years struggling with unemployment and living with his parents, the SS represented an opportunity to transform his life and gain respect in German society. The timing of Kramer's entry into the SS was particularly significant. This was the period when the organization was expanding rapidly in preparation for the Nazi seizure of power. Members like Kramer were not joining an established institution but rather becoming part of a revolutionary movement that promised to remake German society according to racial and ideological principles. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor on January 30, 1933, Josef Kramer found himself on the winning side of history. The Nazi Party moved swiftly to consolidate power, dismantling democratic institutions and establishing a totalitarian state. Within weeks of Hitler's appointment, the regime began constructing concentration camps to house political prisoners, marking the beginning of a system that would ultimately claim millions of lives. For young Nazi Party members like Kramer, these developments represented unprecedented opportunities for advancement. The new regime needed loyal personnel to staff its expanding apparatus of control and oppression. Men who had joined the movement during its struggle for power were rewarded with positions of authority and responsibility that would have been unimaginable under the democratic Weimar Republic. Entry into the concentration camp system. In 1934, 28-year-old Josef Kramer received an assignment that would define the rest of his life. He was posted as a guard at Dachau concentration camp, Germany's first permanent concentration camp and the model for all that would follow. This appointment came through Hans Loritz, an SS officer who would become Kramer's mentor in the art of systematic brutality. Dachau had been established in March 1933, just 2 months after Hitler became Chancellor, and was initially designed to house political prisoners, communists, social democrats, and other opponents of the Nazi regime. Under the leadership of Theodor Eicke, known to his subordinates as Papa Eicke, the camp became a laboratory for developing the methods and mentality that would characterize the entire concentration camp system. Eicke's philosophy was simple and deadly. Tolerance means weakness. He demanded absolute ruthlessness from his guards and created a system of regulations that imposed brutal punishments for the smallest infractions by prisoners. Guards who showed any compassion were told they should retire at once to a monastery. This environment systematically destroyed normal human empathy and replaced it with callous indifference to suffering. For Kramer, who had never lived independently from his parents, Dachau represented his first taste of real authority and purpose. The camp became his school in brutality, where he learned that human beings could be reduced to numbers, that suffering could be inflicted without consequence, and that absolute power over life and death was not only possible but expected. The concentration camp system served multiple functions for the Nazi regime. It removed perceived enemies from society, provided slave labor for economic projects, and created a climate of fear that discouraged opposition. But for the men who staffed these camps, they served another function. They provided careers and opportunities for advancement that required no special skills beyond the willingness to dehumanize and brutalize fellow human beings. Crimes and atrocities. Josef Kramer's reign of terror across Nazi concentration camps left an indelible mark of cruelty that shocked even hardened war crimes investigators. His systematic brutality, methodical torture, and industrial-scale murder operations established him as one of the most ruthless perpetrators of Holocaust atrocities. The documented crimes committed under his command reveal the depths of human cruelty when unconstrained by moral boundaries. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, Kramer personally supervised the gassing of hundreds of thousands of victims. He would stand outside the gas chambers, timing the killing process and making efficiency improvements to maximize death tolls. Survivors testified that Kramer personally selected victims from incoming transports, separating families with deliberate cruelty. He would force parents to watch their children being led to the gas chambers, savoring their anguish before sending the adults to their own deaths. Kramer introduced the practice of deceiving victims by telling them they were going to shower facilities. He personally supervised the construction of fake shower heads in the gas chambers and ensured that soap and towels were distributed to maintain the deception until the final moment. When victims realized their fate and began screaming, Kramer would order the gas to be released immediately, finding their terror more satisfying than a quick death. The commandant personally oversaw the murder of entire Roma families in a single night operation. He ordered the victims to be brought to the gas chambers in family groups, forcing them to witness each other's final moments. When children cried for their parents, Kramer instructed guards to tell them they would be reunited shortly, maintaining the cruel deception until the end. Kramer's involvement in medical experiments represented some of his most sadistic crimes. He personally selected prisoners for sterilization experiments, choosing young women and men in their reproductive prime to maximize the psychological impact. The procedures were conducted without anesthesia on his specific orders, as he believed the screaming would serve as a deterrent to others. In the hypothermia experiments, Kramer would personally immerse naked prisoners in ice water, timing their death throes with a stopwatch. When subjects lost consciousness too quickly, he would revive them and repeat the process, extending their agony for hours. He maintained detailed records of these sessions, noting which methods produced the longest periods of conscious suffering. The starvation experiments under Kramer's supervision involved systematic reduction of food rations while forcing prisoners to perform hard labor. He would weigh victims daily, documenting their deterioration with clinical precision. When prisoners collapsed from hunger, Kramer ordered guards to drag them to their feet and continue working until they died of exhaustion. Kramer personally conducted medical examinations that were elaborate torture sessions. He would use crude surgical instruments to inflict wounds on prisoners, claiming to study healing rates while actually prolonging pain. Pregnant women were subjected to forced abortions without medical care, with Kramer observing the procedures and taking notes on their suffering. The sexual crimes orchestrated by Kramer demonstrated his understanding that humiliation could be as destructive as physical violence. He established a system where female prisoners were forced to strip and perform degrading acts in front of their families. Male guards were instructed to rape female prisoners while their husbands and children were forced to watch, with Kramer supervising these sessions personally. Young girls were subjected to systematic sexual abuse under Kramer's direct orders. He would select the prettiest victims from incoming transports, keeping detailed records of their age and physical characteristics. These children were housed separately and subjected to repeated assault by guards under his command, with Kramer participating in the violence himself. Kramer instituted public rape sessions where selected female prisoners were assaulted in view of the entire camp population. He would announce these events over the camp loudspeaker system, forcing all prisoners to witness the degradation of their fellow inmates. Those who turned away or closed their eyes were beaten unconscious and subjected to the same treatment. The deliberate starvation programs under Kramer's administration were designed to maximize suffering while maintaining a workforce. He calculated exact calorie reductions that would keep prisoners alive long enough to perform labor while ensuring their eventual death from malnutrition. Children were given smaller rations than adults, ensuring their rapid deterioration while parents watched helplessly. Kramer deliberately introduced diseases into camp populations by housing infected prisoners with healthy ones. He would select specific barracks for disease outbreaks, timing the infections to coincide with family arrivals so relatives could witness each other's suffering. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis were spread systematically under his direction. The water contamination programs overseen by Kramer involved introducing human waste into drinking supplies. He would announce that water was safe while knowing it carried deadly pathogens, watching with satisfaction as prisoners became violently ill. Medical treatment was withheld from the sick, allowing diseases to spread throughout the camp population. Kramer's personal acts of violence were characterized by their calculated cruelty. He would select random prisoners for beating sessions, using a variety of instruments to prolong their agony. Leather whips, metal rods, and wooden clubs were employed in specific sequences, designed to maximize pain while preventing quick death. Children were subjected to particularly sadistic treatment under Kramer's direct supervision. He would force parents to choose which of their children would be killed first, beating those who refused to make the selection. Young victims were often tortured in front of their families, with Kramer personally inflicting wounds that would cause slow, painful deaths. The commandant instituted entertainment sessions where prisoners were forced to perform degrading acts for his amusement. These included forcing elderly prisoners to dance naked while guards beat them, making children fight each other for small portions of food, and organizing beauty contests, where women were subjected to sexual humiliation. Kramer's treatment of pregnant women involved forcing them to give birth without medical assistance, then drowning the newborns while the mothers watched. He would time these murders to occur when other prisoners could witness them, using infant deaths to break the spirit of the entire camp population. The Bergen-Belsen Horror. At Bergen-Belsen, Kramer's final command, his crimes reached their ultimate expression of systematic cruelty. He deliberately withheld food, water, and medical supplies while overcrowding barracks beyond human endurance. Prisoners were packed into spaces designed for a fraction of their number, creating conditions where disease spread rapidly and death became inevitable. The death rate at Bergen-Belsen under Kramer's command reached unprecedented levels. By March 1945, between 250 and 300 prisoners were dying every day from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried, leading to mass graves and eventually to corpses simply lying where they fell throughout the camp. Kramer's response to these conditions revealed the complete absence of human compassion that characterized his leadership. When guards complained about the increasing death rate, he reportedly replied, "Let them die. Why should you care?" He instituted morning roll calls that forced even the dying to stand for hours in all weather conditions, claiming this was necessary to prevent laziness among the prisoners. The commandant's personal brutality complemented the systematic horror of camp conditions. Survivors testified to witnessing Kramer crush a female prisoner's skull with a club during a selection in the camp infirmary. He was known to shoot at prisoners with machine guns and set dogs on those who approached the kitchen in search of food scraps. One particularly revealing incident involved a Russian female prisoner who attempted to escape. When she was recaptured, Kramer personally beat her, boxing her ears, kicking and shaking her, and hitting her with a stick on her head and face. When she provided the names of 2 other prisoners who had allegedly helped her, Kramer ordered them beaten as well when they refused to confess their involvement. The mass grave operations under Kramer's supervision involved forcing weakened prisoners to dig enormous pits, then shooting them into the holes they had created. When prisoners became too weak to dig, they were thrown alive into the graves and buried under subsequent layers of corpses. Kramer would walk among the burial pits, shooting any victims who showed signs of life. Cannibalism emerged in the camp under Kramer's deliberate encouragement. He would announce that meat rations were available while providing human flesh from recent victims. Starving prisoners who consumed the meat were then told what they had eaten, driving many to suicide while others descended into madness. The final weeks before liberation saw Kramer's most extreme cruelties. With Allied forces approaching, he accelerated the killing operations while simultaneously denying prisoners any hope of survival. Mock liberation announcements were made over the camp speakers, followed by mass executions of those who had dared to hope for freedom. The Belsen Trial. 2 days after liberation, on April 17, 1945, Josef Kramer was formally arrested and led through the camp in shackles. The man who had exercised absolute power over life and death now found himself a prisoner, facing justice for crimes that challenged the very concept of human civilization. Justice for Josef Kramer and his fellow war criminals came swiftly. On September 17, 1945, just 5 months after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, the Belsen Trial began in Lüneburg, Germany. This was one of the first major war crimes trials conducted by the Allies and set important precedents for the prosecution of crimes against humanity. Kramer stood as the primary defendant among 45 former camp personnel charged with war crimes. The trial was conducted under British military law, reflecting the fact that British forces had liberated the camp and had primary jurisdiction over the prosecution of its staff. The proceedings were designed not only to deliver justice but also to create a comprehensive record of Nazi crimes for history. At the beginning of the trial, Kramer pleaded not guilty to all charges, as did most of his co-defendants. This was a strategic decision by defense attorneys who hoped to argue that their clients had simply been following orders and were not personally responsible for the crimes committed at the camps. Kramer specifically denied that the allegations regarding Auschwitz gas chambers, mass executions, whipping, and cruelty were true. However, as the trial proceeded and evidence mounted against him, Kramer was forced to modify his defense strategy. He eventually admitted to being present during selections for the gas chambers at Auschwitz but claimed he had never taken an active part in the selection process. This partial admission was undermined by testimony from survivors who had witnessed his direct participation in loading victims onto trucks bound for the gas chambers. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Kramer's crimes. Auschwitz survivor Anita Lasker testified that she had personally witnessed Kramer participating in selections at the camp. Other survivors described his personal brutality, including the incident where he crushed a female prisoner's skull with a club and his practice of shooting at starving prisoners who approached the kitchen. Perhaps most damning was Kramer's own admission regarding the gassing of 86 Jewish prisoners at Natzweiler-Struthof. He acknowledged that he had personally supervised these murders but claimed he had been acting under direct orders from Heinrich Himmler and did not consider the killings to be crimes. This admission revealed not only his direct involvement in murder but also his complete lack of moral understanding about his actions. When questioned about conditions at Bergen-Belsen, Kramer attempted to shift blame to his superiors and to wartime circumstances beyond his control. He claimed that the catastrophic conditions in the camp were the result of orders from above, and that he had done his best to care for the prisoners given the resources available to him. This defense was contradicted by testimony from camp guards who quoted him as saying, "Let them die. Why should you care?" when complained to about the death rate. The trial also examined Kramer's relationship with other notorious Nazi criminals, including Irma Gries, the female guard known as the Hyena of Auschwitz, who had allegedly been his lover. When asked about Gries, who was also on trial, Kramer said he could only say the very best about her and praised her dedication to duty, even though she was known for her exceptional cruelty toward prisoners. The only person to testify on Kramer's behalf was his wife, Rosina, to whom he had been married since October 1937. She attempted to portray him as a devoted family man who had been caught up in circumstances beyond his control. However, her testimony could not overcome the massive evidence of his voluntary participation in and leadership of mass murder. Judgment and final appeals. On November 17, 1945, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the military court delivered its verdict. Josef Kramer was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death by hanging. The judgment reflected the court's conclusion that he had been a willing and enthusiastic participant in crimes against humanity, not merely a passive follower of orders. The court specifically found that Kramer had personally participated in the selection of victims for gas chambers at Auschwitz, had supervised the gassing of 86 Jewish prisoners at Natzweiler-Struthof, and had been responsible for the horrific conditions at Bergen-Belsen that had led to thousands of deaths. The judges rejected his defense that he had simply been following orders, noting that he had shown enthusiasm for his duties and had gone beyond what was required by his superiors. The death sentence was not unexpected, given the scale and nature of Kramer's crimes, but it represented a significant moment in the development of international law regarding war crimes and crimes against humanity. The trial established important precedents about individual responsibility for mass atrocities and rejected the defense of superior orders when applied to crimes of this magnitude. Faced with the death sentence, Kramer made one final attempt to escape justice. On November 18, just one day after his sentencing, he submitted a petition for clemency to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British commander responsible for confirming the sentence. This document revealed both his continued refusal to accept responsibility for his crimes and his fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of justice. In his clemency petition, Kramer blamed the catastrophic conditions at Bergen-Belsen entirely on his superiors, claiming that he had been powerless to improve the situation due to orders from above and wartime circumstances. He portrayed himself as a conscientious officer who had remained at his post out of concern for the prisoners entrusted to his care, rather than fleeing like other Nazi officials. Most telling was Kramer's claim that he was completely innocent of the crimes charged against him and his assertion that he was not a war criminal. He maintained that he had not killed any human being on his own initiative and had been only a soldier carrying out orders from his military superiors. This final statement revealed that even facing death, Kramer had learned nothing from his trial and felt no genuine remorse for his actions. The clemency petition was a masterpiece of self-deception and moral blindness. Kramer presented himself as a victim of circumstances, a dedicated officer who had sacrificed himself for duty, and a scapegoat for the crimes of others. He showed no understanding of the suffering he had caused or the moral enormity of his actions. Field Marshal Montgomery and the reviewing authorities were unmoved by Kramer's appeals. The evidence of his crimes was overwhelming. His personal responsibility was clear, and the nature of his offenses demanded the ultimate penalty. The clemency petition was denied, and the death sentence was confirmed. Final hours and execution. On the morning of December 13, 1945, Josef Kramer woke for the last time in his cell at Hamelin Prison. At 39 years of age, the former electrician's apprentice who had become one of Nazi Germany's most notorious war criminals would finally pay the ultimate price for his crimes against humanity. The British had chosen Albert Pierrepoint, England's chief executioner, to carry out the sentence. Pierrepoint was a highly experienced hangman who took professional pride in conducting executions quickly and efficiently. He had studied the physical characteristics of each condemned prisoner to ensure that the drop would be calculated precisely to cause instant death. Prison records indicate that Kramer spent his final hours much as he had spent the trial, showing no signs of remorse or recognition of the gravity of his crimes. He did not request to see a chaplain, nor did he express any desire to apologize to the families of his victims. The man who had supervised the deaths of tens of thousands remained emotionally detached even from his own impending execution. At 10 a.m., guards came to escort Kramer from his cell to the execution chamber. British execution protocol required that the condemned prisoner be pinioned with leather straps and escorted by prison officials and a chaplain, regardless of whether religious services were requested. The walk from the cell to the gallows took only a few minutes, but it represented the final journey of a man whose choices had led to unimaginable suffering. On the gallows, Kramer was asked if he had any final words. According to witnesses, he made no statement and showed no emotion as the noose was placed around his neck. The hood was pulled over his head, and at exactly 10:07 a.m., Pierrepoint released the trapdoor. Josef Kramer's neck was broken instantly, and he was pronounced dead by the attending physician. The execution was witnessed by British officials, representatives of the press, and several former prisoners from Bergen-Belsen who had survived to see justice done. For these survivors, Kramer's death could not restore what they had lost or heal the trauma they had endured, but it provided some measure of closure and demonstrated that even the most powerful perpetrators of evil could be held accountable for their actions. The careful legal proceedings that led to Kramer's execution demonstrated that justice could prevail, even after such unprecedented cruelty. His trial set important precedents in international criminal law, with the International Criminal Court and war crimes tribunals, like those in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, drawing from the principles established during his trial. These legal frameworks continue to prosecute crimes against humanity, reflecting the lasting impact of trials like Kramer's on global justice systems. Kramer's execution was not only an instance of justice served, but also a warning to future generations. It serves as a reminder that evil can emerge from the most ordinary circumstances and can be perpetrated by seemingly unremarkable people. The lesson from Kramer's life and death is clear. Only constant vigilance, unwavering commitment to human dignity, and the courage to resist institutional pressure can prevent future atrocities. The world must remain alert to the potential for such cruelty, ensuring that history does not repeat itself. Josef Kramer's execution marked both the end of one man's descent into evil and the beginning of a global commitment to international justice and human rights. His death symbolized the efforts of humanity to ensure the phrase "never again" is not just a slogan, but a meaningful principle that guides global action against atrocities. Kramer's execution may have closed the chapter on his life, but but the vigilance required to prevent future perpetrators of such cruelty remains an ongoing responsibility for all.